So, welcome to the CCSP Masterclass last minute preparation, everyone. Before we get started, let me give you a brief introduction about myself. My name is Manigandan. I have around 15 years of work experience into the cybersecurity domain. I have worked on different tools like IBM QRadar, Splunk, IBM Security Guardian, Imperva. I am a Microsoft certified trainer. I am a Microsoft certified trainer for the last from the year 2007. In terms of my certifications, I am a CISSP certified. I also have a CCSP certification along with CEH and CSISO from EC Council. I am also certified in IBM QRadar, IBM Guardian, and your Splunk Enterprise Security. In terms of my cloud certifications, I have a AWS Architect Associate and AWS Security Specialty. So that's pretty much the introduction about myself. So once again, welcome everyone to the CCSP Masterclass last minute preparation. Now in this topic, we are going to discuss the domain agenda is understanding the basic cloud computing concepts, describe the cloud reference architecture, understanding the security concepts related to the cloud computing, then understand design principles of secure cloud computing. So the first thing which we are going to discuss is the understanding cloud computing roles. So the first role in a cloud computing is your cloud service provider. Now, what is a cloud service provider? Cloud service provider is probably one of the most visible components when we are talking about a cloud computing. In all possibilities, we would all have encountered this word without actually knowing its meaning and significance. So now when I am talking about a cloud service provider or a CSP in an organization, they hosts all the services such as your networking, software, server infrastructure, and more. So live example, in addition, they also employ and manage staff and provide security for the services they provide. So live example, we have a AWS, we have a Azure, we have a GCP. They are all examples of a cloud service provider only. So now when I'm talking about a cloud service provider team, it's basically a CSP in an organization which hosts all the services such as networking, software, server infrastructure, and more. In addition, they also employ and manage the staff and provide security for the services they provide. This relieves the client organizations of their individual responsibility of setting up their infrastructure and managing them. So some of the best examples of a cloud service provider is your Azure, Salesforce, GCP, and AWS. The next is team, we have a cloud customer. Now, what do you mean by a cloud customer? The cloud customer is the organization who is seeking some or more cloud services from the cloud provider. Now, it depends on the organization that whether the organization wants to rely only on one cloud provider, whether the organization wants to rely only on one cloud service provider, or whether the organization wants to rely on multiple cloud service provider. Like in the live example, we have seen many organizations like Accenture, TCS, Tech Mahindra, rather than having one cloud service provider, they normally have a multi-cloud service provider. So they use multi-cloud. So for some services they use AWS, for some services they use Azure, and for some services they use GCP. So majority of the organizations, rather than having dependency on one cloud vendor or cloud service provider, they normally consume services of a multi-cloud service provider. So normally we have seen organizations that for some services like EC2 and S3 buckets, they will be preferring to use AWS. For some services like Docker and all, they normally go for Azure related services, and for some services they use the GCP. So that depends totally on the organization. So Amit, the reason why do they go for multiple cloud providers, because in certain areas, okay, AWS has a, like if I am talking about, AWS has a wider market in terms of a S3 bucket and in terms of EC2 instances. So it also depends on the pricing and all. So like one live example is, like if we are talking about Docker, if we are talking about micro segmentation, then many customers they prefer to use Docker on Azure environment than AWS. So there are multiple factors involved. Cost is one of the major constraint, and also the features. Some features AWS provides better than Azure. Some features Azure provides better services than AWS. Clear, Amit? Now, when we are talking about the cloud broker, the next is we have a cloud broker. Now, one of the major reason, now, whenever an organization is planning to go for a cloud solution, there is always a confusion that which vendor to choose. Whether we should go for the AWS, whether we should go for the Azure, whether we should go for a GCP. So a cloud broker is basically, as more and more organizations, they migrate their necessary infrastructure to the cloud. Cloud computing itself becomes more complicated and gradually undergoes many changes. It then becomes a cumbersome task for any customer to choose an appropriate cloud service provider. This is where your cloud broker they comes into the picture. So in this case, a cloud broker, you can say that they act as a mediator between the cloud service provider and the customer. Okay, so they help the customer to choose the correct vendor which meets their business requirements, and they also help the cloud customer and the cloud provider to negotiate their terms and conditions. So if the organization want, if the organization the requirements, if the organization is unable to decide that which kind of cloud provider they should go for, whether they should go for AWS, whether they should go for a Azure, whether they should go for a GCP, in that case they will go for a cloud broker. See, in this case, Augustine, cloud architect is not a cloud broker. You can say that your cloud broker is just like your managed services, a company who is understanding your requirement and they are suggesting which cloud services the organization should go for. Clear, Augustine? So in this case, you can say that they are the one who are mediating the terms and conditions between the cloud broker and between the cloud provider and the cloud customer. So that is what your cloud broker is all about. So they are only responsible for, so the cloud broker is an organization which mediates the cloud service provider and the cloud customer. They enable the customer organization to choose the correct vendor according to the business needs. They also help the customer to negotiate the terms and condition, pricing, and other details with the cloud service provider. Now the next is team, we have a cloud access security broker. Now this is, in the past few years we have seen a greater need by the organization for a CASB solution. So majority of the organization, they are today, majority of the organization who are moving on to the cloud solutions, instead of using one cloud vendor, they are working with multiple cloud vendor. So now when there is a requirement of working with multiple cloud vendor, then in that case we need to enforce the security, compliance, governance and cloud applications for multi-cloud multi-cloud products. So now when I am talking about multi-cloud products, so if the organization is having AWS, Azure, GCP, so I need to enforce the security, compliance, governance for cloud applications which are there on my multi-cloud. This is where my CASB comes into the picture. So as cloud adoptions increase in number of security, as the cloud adoptions increase in number, security becomes more than a necessity. Cloud access security brokers or CASB is the answer to improved security for cloud services. So now we have a different kind of vendors who are today providing the CASB solutions. Like one of them is your Netscope is there, ForcePoint is there. Then we have a Cisco Cloud Log is there. These are all my cloud access security broker solutions. They are your CASB solutions, which are today provided by many vendors. Majority of the market is being ruled by Netscope, ForcePoint, and Cisco CloudLog. So CASB organizations that are present on premise or on the cloud can act as an intermediary between the cloud service providers and cloud customers. According to the McAfee website, CASB enforces security, compliance and governance for cloud applications. So when the organization wants to enforce security, compliance and governance, not only within the single cloud provider, but also they want the centralized control, centralized monitoring in a multi-cloud environment, they can go for a CASB solution, cloud access security broker. Finally, we have a regulators. So regulators such as FTC and Security and Exchange Commission. Okay. Balaji, there are multiple cloud service CASB providers. So like we have a Netscope, we have a ForcePoint, we have a Cisco CloudLock. So there are multiple CASB service providers, but majority of the market is being ruled by Netscope, ForcePoint, and Cisco CloudLock. Now, when we are talking about regulators such as the FTC and Security and Exchange Commission, they ensures that the companies stay in compliance with the regulatory frameworks such as HIPAA, SOC, and GLBA and other frameworks. So now everyone basically, if you want to evaluate the security, that whether the cloud vendor is following all the regulations, so normally we ask the cloud vendor to share the reports. Like we ask the cloud vendor to share the SOC 1 reports, we ask the cloud vendor to share the SOC 2 reports, we ask the cloud vendor to share the CSA star report. These are the reports by which we can evaluate the security of the cloud vendor. We evaluate the security of the cloud vendor. So we can, if you want to evaluate the security of the cloud vendor, you can ask for a SOC 1, SOC 2 or CSA star reports or your ISO 27001 reports. You can ask by which you can evaluate the security of the cloud vendor. So these are the reports which we can ask for a cloud service provider to share. Now there are some other cloud roles as well. So we have a cloud auditor as well, which is basically a third party organization that verifies the attainment of the service level agreement. So whatever service level agreement has been agreed by the cloud vendor, whether the cloud vendor is meeting those SLAs. So the cloud auditor is a third party organization that verifies the attainment of the SLAs which has been agreed by the cloud vendor to the customer. So that is what your cloud auditor is all about. Then we also have something called as a cloud computing reseller. So cloud computing reseller is a company that purchases the hosting services from a cloud server hosting or cloud computing provider and then resells them into its own customers. So live example we can say like your GoDaddy. So GoDaddy is also a best example of a reseller only, because they are, they are selling these services to their own customers. So cloud computing reseller means where the company is purchasing the services from the cloud vendor and then reselling them to its own customers. That is what is your cloud computing reseller is all about. So live example, your GoDaddy and all is working on the same concept of a reseller. Now the next is team we are going to discuss the cloud computing concepts. So in this topic we are going to discuss the cloud computing definitions, the key cloud computing characteristics, the cloud computing deployment models. So what is a cloud computing? Cloud computing is any case where computer services are being delivered to customer at a remote location over a network. Cloud describes the use of collection of services, applications, information, and infrastructure comprised of pools, compute, network, and storage resources. It separates application and information resources from the underlying infrastructure and the mechanisms by which we are delivering them. These pools can be rapidly orchestrated, provisioned, implemented, and decommissioned and scaled up and down as per the requirements of the organization. Now, when I am talking about the cloud computing, okay, now there are three types of services. One is your infrastructure as a service, one is your platform as a service, and one is your software as a service. So in the infrastructure as a service, the customer is responsible for managing the server. The customer is responsible for managing the networking to a certain extent. And the customer is responsible to manage the storage like the S3 buckets, the EFS volumes and all that. Okay. Now, when I am talking about platform as a service, so platform as a service means where we are getting a runtime. So in the platform as a service, the customer is only responsible for the code which the customer is bringing. One good example of a platform as a service I can give is in the platform as a service. So let's say if I developed a website, Now I went to the godaddy.com and I registered my domain. Now the GoDaddy is giving me a server where I am copying the code where the website will be run. So as a owner of the website, I am only responsible for the code which I have uploaded on the GoDaddy. But I am not responsible to maintain the server or to take the backup. To a certain extent, I am responsible for the code as well as the environment on which that code is running. So definitely that code will be having some kind of prerequisite, like it requires a Java runtime or it requires a .NET framework and all. So those I will be responsible. But other than that, maintaining the server, taking the backup of the server, all that is not the responsibility of the customer. That is the responsibility of the provider. That is your platform as a service. Now when we are talking about software as a service, the best example of a software as a service, okay, is your Office 365, your Splunk cloud. Okay, your Splunk cloud, your Office 365, in which the customer is only responsible for the data. Rest all things are managed by the cloud vendor. One another example of a platform as a service, we can say the Google App Engine is the best example of a platform as a service, where we are uploading our code where it is running. Your micro segmentation, your Docker, Kubernetes, they are also best example of a platform as a service. So now if you see, this is the example of how the infrastructure as a service works. So we have a compute controller where we have hosted all the VMs. Okay, and then we have a storage controller where we are storing all the disks which are being used by the VMs. So we have a storage pool and we have a compute pool. Now, even though this storage pool and compute pool are two different servers, but when the customer access to the outside world, these two servers are working as one. So this is called as a distributed computing or a cluster. So even though these two servers are separate, but for the outside world, they are working as one. That is how in the infrastructure as a service things works. So now when we are talking about the perspective from a user, now what is the perspective of a user? Or what is the perspective of a cloud customer? The cloud customer, they do not care about how the work is getting done. Instead, they only concern about what they can get. They certainly do not care what the provider actually did to get the service up and running. They don't want to own the physical infrastructure. All they need is the service. All they need is the service. That is the perspective from a customer when they are going for a cloud solution. When they are going for a cloud solution. So in the cloud, we get different kind of resources. So we get compute, we get storage, we get network, and along, so the customer can launch the compute instances. They can launch AWS S3 buckets or Azure blob storage. They can launch VPCs, they can create subnets, they can create gateways. All these are my resource pool which the customer can launch. Now, what is the benefit? Why the organization they are planning to go? Why the organization is slowly moving or rapidly moving from the on-prem infrastructure to the cloud? Because there is no capital expenditure. So basically, when an organization is moving to the cloud, they are moving from capital expenditure to the operational expenditure. They are moving from capital expenditure to the operational expenditure. So now let's take an example of this. Let's say that currently, just a second. So let's say currently I am planning to host an HRMS application. I am planning to host an HRMS application on my on-prem. Okay. I am planning to host an HRMS application on my on-prem. Now, when I am planning to host an HRMS application on my on-prem, so let us understand what is the cost factor which is involved if I want to launch the HRMS application on my on-prem. Let's say currently, if I am talking about the hardware point of view, I have to spend minimum around $15,000 for the hardware. Say I am spending around $15,000 to the hardware. Okay. Then I am spending additional $5,000 for the software. Here, when I am talking about the software, means I am talking about the operating system, applications, licenses, everything. Then apart from that, I am also, now if I want to install it, so definitely for installing again I am going to spend another $2,000. So which means 15 plus 5, 20, and around $22,000 I have to spend if I want to install this HRMS application on in my on premises. This is my capital expenditure. This is my capital expenditure. Now let us analyze the same thing if I go for a cloud. In the cloud, I don't have to spend money on the hardware. I don't have to spend money on purchasing the software. I don't have to spend money on installing and configuration. What I am getting is I am basically going to the cloud solution and I am paying a subscription fees. I am paying a subscription fees. I am paying a subscription fees to the cloud vendor. Probably, let's say in this case, I am paying somewhere around 5,000. Let's say I am paying around $5,000 as a subscription fees to the cloud vendor. But with this, I am getting much more advantages which I was not getting in the capital expenditure. Now, what is the first advantage I am getting? The first and foremost, the biggest advantage is anywhere I can access my HRMS application. I can access the application from anywhere. That is the primary advantage which I can get if I am moving to the cloud. Second, I am getting an on demand. So I am getting on demand resources. So I can scale up and I can scale down. I can scale up and scale down depending on the load, depending on the requirements of my organization. And the third biggest factor, it is reducing the cost. It is reducing the cost. Not only it is reducing the cost of the hardware, it is also reducing the cost of the software, it is reducing the cost of the people, it is reducing the power, HVAC, everything. That is one of the main reason why the organization, they normally go for a cloud, because they are saving, they are moving from the capital expenditure to the operational expenditure. This is one of the main benefit of going for a cloud solution. So there are no capital expenditures using public cloud. You get much more agility. You get an unbound scale. You can improve resource utilization. So basically, you can increase and decrease as per your business requirements. You can control which kind of resources will be moved to the cloud. You are basically paying for resiliency and you are only paying for what you use. You are only paying for what you use. Nothing more, nothing less. That is the benefits of going for a cloud computing. Now, as per the NIST 5 key requirements of cloud computing, there are 5 key requirements. So we have a on-demand self-service, we have a broad network access, we have a resource pooling, we have a rapid elasticity, and we have a measured service. Now, what do you mean by on-demand self-service? Now, when I am talking about the on-demand self-service, in the on-demand self-service, so let's say in this case, currently I am planning, let's again talk about from an on-premises perspective. Let's currently talk about from an on-premises perspective. Let's say currently I am planning to install one accounting application. I am planning to install one accounting application in my organization. Okay. Now, in order to install the accounting application, first I have to raise a request. I have to raise a request for a server. I have to raise a request for a server. That is the first process. Then I need to get that request approved. I need to get that request approved. Finally, by the time that request, once I submitted a request that I am planning to install an accounting application on an on-prem server, I need to first raise a request for this server. Let's say the budget for this is around 5,000 US dollars. So first I need to get that budget approved. Then the organization will purchase the server. The organization will purchase the server. It will probably take around 1 to 2 weeks. It will probably take around 1 to 2 weeks for the vendor to assemble for the vendor to deliver the server, and probably it will take around 1 more week. It will take up 1 more week for me to configure that server. So if I say around minimum 3 to 4 weeks I need 3 to 4 weeks to, after I raise the request for acquiring or procuring a server. By the time I get that server and I install the application and get it running, it takes around minimum 3 to 4 weeks. Okay, but the same thing, if I am going for a cloud based solution, In the cloud, I can simply, what it is taking me 3 to 4 weeks to get the server up and running, in cloud, I can get this probably within 10 to 15 minutes. I can get this probably within 10 to 15 minutes because I need to choose the OS, I need to choose the platform, and I can spin an instance running within 10 to 15 minutes, which means within a week, my accounting application will be installed, it will be up and running. That is the advantage of going for an on-demand self-service. That is the advantage of going for an on-demand self-service. But there is a famous quote in a Spider-Man movie that with great power comes with great responsibility. If you are not careful, this on-demand self-service can cause a very big issue on your organization. It can be a disastrous tool if you don't control, because if unauthorized user, or if all employees in the organization they have access to the AWS, Azure and GCP console, then what they will do, they will keep on launching new instances, new services on the cloud, and the organization will get the billing of that. So that is the reason you must have noticed in the organization that normally only the cloud team they have access to the AWS, Azure and GCP console. Other than that, no one has access to the cloud console of the cloud providers. The major reason for this is because if the users are not careful, then the organization billing will go high, because they will launch the instances, they will not delete it, which will unwantedly increase the billing cost of your organization. So that is the reason why this on demand self service can be dangerous if it falls into the wrong hands. Now the next is we have a broad network access. So one of the advantage of going for a cloud because of broad network access. So now what do you mean by broad network access? Majority of the organizations, we have seen that some organizations they also keep their data backed up and running on the cloud. So tomorrow, let's say your organization is having a data center in Tokyo, your organization is having a data center in Japan. Okay, now the entire facility is damaged due to an earthquake. Now the entire facility is damaged due to an earthquake. As long as your data is there on the cloud, as long as your data is there on the cloud, all you need is an internet connection. All you need is an internet connection. You can connect to the internet from anywhere. From anywhere using the internet connection, you can connect to the cloud vendor and you can download your data. So that is the advantage of going for a cloud computing. Because of its broad network access, the data can be accessible from almost anywhere. Okay, so even if your organizations, so majority of the organizations they keep their entire disaster recovery site running on the cloud because of the broad network access. So even if the primary facility, if your on-prem data center is down due to a fire, flood, earthquake, anything, the data can still be accessible from the cloud. All you need is an internet connection. That is the advantage of going for a cloud vendor, which covers under the broad network access. The next is we have a resource pooling. Now, what do you mean by resource pooling? Resource pooling means pooling the resources. So now let's say in this case, I have a requirement. I have a server one. I have a requirement of running. I am currently running an HRMS application. I am currently running an HRMS application on server 1, and I am running a accounting application. I am running an accounting application on server 2. But the problem is this HRMS and server, this HRMS application which is running on server 1 and this accounting application which is running on server 2, on normal days it is only consuming 15% of the CPU and memory utilization. On normal days, it is consuming only 15% of the overall CPU and memory utilization. On busy days, it goes up to maximum 20%, not more than that. Same is with the server 2 as well. In server 2 also, I am only consuming around 20% of the CPU and memory utilization on normal days. On busy days, it goes up to maximum 25%. Now the problem is, even even though the remaining hard CPU and memory resources on these server are sitting idle, I cannot use it. I cannot install any other applications, because if I do, then I am ultimately increasing the attack surface. I am violating the least privilege principle, because the more applications you deploy on the server, it will greatly increase the attack surface. So now whatever resources are available over here, that is sitting idle. So now what we are doing in the resource pooling, we are pooling the resources of multiple servers, and we are providing the benefit to the customer, where the customer can launch greater number of instances. So if a customer wants to launch an instance of 2 GB memory and around 10 GB as a 10 GB disk, that is also the customer can launch. If the customer wants to launch a CPU of 128 GB memory, 128 GB memory, and customer wants to launch with a disk of 2 terabyte, that is also customer can launch. So in the resource pooling, what we are doing is we are pooling the resources from multiple servers and providing the facility to the customer to launch greater instances on the cloud. That is the advantage of going for a resource pooling. The next is we have a rapid elasticity. Now, what do you mean by rapid elasticity? Rapid elasticity means I can scale up, and I can scale down depending on my business requirements. So like now it is the festive seasons are going to start. So now within few days we are going to have festivals, like we are going to have Ganesh Chaturthi, okay, we are going to have Navaratri, we are going to have Diwali. Now there are a lot of festivals coming in. Now normally we have seen that during the festive seasons, specifically the e-commerce, there is a huge amount of traffic which happens on the e-commerce side, because many people they buy, some people they buy gold, silver, some people they they buy electronic appliances because of heavy discounts and all. So normally there are during this particular time, there is an excessive traffic, which is there on the e-commerce site. So now what is the advantage of going for a rapid elasticity? The advantage of going for a rapid elasticity means I can scale up and I can scale down depending on my business requirements. So I know that during this time, the number of users accessing my e-commerce website will be more. So depending on the load, I can scale up, and depending once the load is reduced, I can scale down. So horizontal and vertical scaling is possible. And one of the advantage of going for a rapid elasticity is whatever number of instances I have launched, only for that I have to pay. So that is the, so now let's say in order to support my e-commerce website. Okay, so now let's say if during Ganesh Chaturthi, during Navratri, during Diwali, let's say currently I in my on-prem server. Okay, I'm talking about my on-premises data center. Just a second. So let's say I'm talking about in my on-prem data center, I was already having 15 servers. I was already having 15 servers which was running my e-commerce web application, Now, in order to support the festive seasons, I added 15 more servers. So one of the advantage of the cloud pay as you go model is you only have to pay what you use. So you only have to pay for the additional 15 servers which you have used. Nothing more, nothing less. That is what your measured service is all about. That is what your measured service is all about. So these are the NIST 5 key requirements of a cloud computing. So now the cloud computing characteristics, we get an on-demand self-service. So cloud services can be requested, it can be provisioned and put into use by the customer through automated means without the need to interact with a person. For enterprise customers, this is the most likely the least important characteristic. However, when we are talking about for the enterprise customer, okay, for the enterprise customer or the organization, they are not, for them, on demand self service, broad network access, resource pooling, rapid elasticity, these all four features are of no use. What the eye catching feature for them is the measured service, because the cloud moves from capital expenditure to the operational expenditure. So you basically pay as you go model. You pay as you use. One live example I can give you of the measured service is, that is a best example of a, pay as you go model. Initially, if anyone would have used Zoom car facility, earlier the Zoom car we used to have, where you can rent a car for around 8-10 hours, and you are earlier they used to charge on a per day basis. So earlier when they was charging on a per day basis, it was much more cheaper, because you can rent probably a Maruti Baleno, or you can rent a, a seven-seater car by paying around 4,000 5,000 rupees for an entire day. But today they have changed their model. Now they are charging on a per hour basis. So let's say for per hour they are charging around 500 to 600 rupees. That is your live example of a measured service. So for a customer, for the organization, more than on-demand self-service, broad network access, resource pooling, rapid elasticity, their eye-catching feature is the measured service. So that is the reason why it is mentioned that for enterprise customers, this is the most likely the least important characteristics. Broad network access, think convenience access, what you want when you need it from any location. Data location independence complicates the verification of legal compliance. Compatibility issues, inability of apply control security, inability of applying control or security control across all variation and non-standardization has stemmed this somewhat. So one of the best example of a broad network access is the data is readily available from almost anywhere across the world. All you need is a dedicated internet connection. You need a dedicated internet connection to access your data from anywhere. That is the primary advantage of using cloud. Many organizations today, they are taking their backup and they are storing their backup files on the AWS S3 or Azure Blob storage because of the broad network access feature. So the on-demand self-service, it enables the consumers to unilaterally provision computing capabilities like server time, storage capacity as needed. Consumers, they view service catalog via web-based user interface and use it to request for a service anytime, anywhere with any device accessing any services. The broad network access computing capabilities are available over the network. Computing capabilities are accessed from a broad range of client platforms such as desktop computer, laptop, tablet, and mobile device. Now, one of the live example, many people, they don't readily get the idea of what broad network access is. So let me give you a live example of a broad network access. So majority of the people who are working in IT, okay, now if we are talking about in India, if we are talking about the cities in India, we have a tier 1 cities, we have a tier 2 cities, and we have a tier 3 cities, right? So in tier 1 cities, if you if we see the connectivity in the tier 1 cities, whether it is any connectivity, whether it is travel, whether it is internet, whether it is availability of cab, availability of any kind of services, is much more better than in a tier 2 or a tier 3 city, right team? One live example I will give you. How many of you in, I believe in tier 1 cities, when we apply for a Geo fiber or Airtel fiber or Tata Sky fiber, do we need to pay for the installation cost? The installation is free, right? The installation is free, right, in majority of the metro cities like Mumbai, Delhi, Hyderabad and Chennai. But the same thing, when you go for a tier 2 and tier 3 cities, you have to also pay for the installation cost. It means the router cost you have to bear. One another live example I can give you in the facilities when I am comparing between the tier 1 and tier 2 is, in tier 1 cities, they don't charge you for the optical fiber cable. But when you go to purchase a broadband connection in a tier 2 or tier 3 city, if the optical fiber cable is, if they are requiring more than 5 meters of optical fiber cable, they ask the customer to pay the charge. So one of the primary advantage of going for a cloud vendor is the broad network access. So when you are going for a, yeah, they give device also free. That you are right, Amit. So one of the major, that is, this is one of the reason why enterprise customers like Accenture, TCS, HCL, they normally go for a, cloud vendor solution like AWS, Azure and GCP, rather than going for a local vendor, rather than going for a local vendor. So resource pooling, it is the characteristics that allows the cloud provider to meet various demands from customers while remaining financially viable. The provider computing resources are pooled to serve multiple consumers using a multi-tenant model. The activity of different tenants may interfere one with the others. So one of the biggest thing in the cloud is, because see, cloud is a shared hardware. So it's in a simple layman language, I can tell that you are keeping your eggs in someone else's basket. So now when we are talking about the cloud, one of the major feature of cloud is a multi-tenant model. So you need to have proper physical and logical isolation, so that customer one, if there are, if in the same hardware, if we have a customer one and customer two, both data are stored on the same hardware, customer one should not be able to access customer two data and vice versa. So the tenant isolation or logical isolation needs to have, it's an important characteristic when we are going for any cloud vendor. Finally, we have a rapid elasticity, which capabilities can be rapidly and elastically provisioned, in some cases automatically, to quickly scale out and rapidly release to quickly scaling. This is of a particular benefit to seasonal or event type business utilizing cloud services. It introduces a degree of dynamicity that makes audit and assessment more difficult. So this is the cloud deployment. The next is team, we are going to discuss about the cloud deployment model. Now we have a public cloud, we have a private cloud, we have a community cloud, and we have a hybrid cloud. Now all these points we are going to discuss. Now first we are going to discuss the private cloud model. Okay, now when I am talking about a private cloud means it is owned by a single company. Okay, it is owned by a single organization. When I am talking about a private cloud, it is owned by a single organization. Okay, but many customers or many people, they think that when I am going for a cloud, when I am talking about a private cloud means it can be only maintained by the organization. There is no necessity. I can also ask AWS, or I can also ask Azure. I can also ask AWS, or I can also ask Azure to build a on-prem data center for me. Okay, nowadays AWS, Azure, and GCP, they have that kind of services where they can build a private cloud for you. Definitely, that will be managed by the cloud service provider. Definitely, it's not going to be cheap, it is going to be costly. But this misunderstanding which is there, that the private cloud is only maintained by the organization, this is a misconception. It can be maintained by a client, or it can be also maintained by a cloud service provider like AWS and Azure. One of the biggest benefit of the private cloud is increased control. So I will be able to control my resources. I will be able to control each and everything. Okay, each and every element of my organization I will be able to control. So one of the primary benefit of going for a private cloud model is increased control. The another benefit of going for a private cloud is retaining the ownership. I can retain the ownership of the assets which belongs to the organization. And plus, I can implement additional governance controls. I can implement additional governance of controls which is required as per the mandatory regulations and all. I can have excessive controls applied on my private cloud. These are some of the benefits of going for a private cloud solution. These are some of the benefits of going for a private cloud solution. Okay, plus, apart from all this, one of the biggest benefits of the private cloud is assurance. One of the biggest benefit of a private cloud is assurance of data location. You basically know where your data is stored. Now, one of the primary reason why even now majority of the companies, like companies who are based on Saudi region, they still are not comfortable to use the cloud solution. One of the prime reason of not going for the cloud is we don't know where that our data is stored. So in the private cloud model, you get an assurance of the data location. These are one of the benefit of going for a private cloud. So you basically know where your data is stored. So there is a very less possibility of you getting into compliance breach and all, because your data was replicated outside of the country. So let's say one live example is, if you are following the GDPR compliance, then according to the GDPR compliance, the data must be there within the EU region. It should not replicate outside of the EU region. If it is replicated outside of the EU region to a country which is not falling under the GDPR, then it means that is a GDPR data breach. Okay, so these are one of the main reasons why the organization can go for a private cloud. Increased control, retaining of the ownership of the data center, implementing governance, additional governance control, getting an assurance of data location, and primary and one of the last benefit is maintaining the privacy. These are some of the benefits of going for a private cloud model. Now the next is team, we have a public cloud model. So what is the benefits? Public cloud, as the name indicates, it can be used by anybody. Yes, so you can say in the private cloud, we get assurance, we get data localization, we get data privacy, additional governance of control, all these things we get it in the private cloud. Amit, clear? So now when we are talking about a public cloud is something which can be our hardware resources are also being shared in the private cloud. Hardware resources, see, what do you mean by our hardware resources also being shared in the private cloud? See, no, in the if the data center is operated by if the data center is operated by the cloud vendor, then even that hardware will be only used by that customer. That hardware will not be used by any other customer to store their data. That is how the contract with the company and the cloud vendor will be created. Clear? So now the next is team, we have a public cloud. So now in the public cloud, it is something which is anybody can use. Okay. Now what are the benefits of going for a public cloud? One of the primary benefit of going for a public cloud is ease of use. That is the primary benefit. Okay. The second benefit is the user data is isolated. User data is isolated. That is the next benefit of going for a public cloud model. Okay, so live example, we have a AWS, we have a GCP, we have a Azure. These are all the best examples of a cloud service provider. So now when we are talking about from a public cloud point of view, it can be accessible by anybody. Now when I say it can be accessible by anybody, it means what? It can be accessible by also the attackers. It can be also accessible by the attackers. That is the reason why in the cloud vendors, they consistently monitor the environment, and they they monitor their environment, and they remove the people who are misusing the cloud services. They remove the people like attackers and all who misuse the cloud services. So one of the primary benefits of going for a public cloud model is it can be used by anyone. So ease of use is there. User data can be isolated. But when I say that the user data can be isolated, it means when I say it can be accessed by anybody, even an attacker can access the cloud deployment model. So that is the reason why the cloud vendors, they consistently monitor their cloud resources. If anyone, if any customer, they launch and if they try to do anything which is violating the principles of cloud, they immediately revoke the access and delete the instances which has been launched by that customer. So live example, I can say that in the cloud, in the public cloud model, you cannot have Linux, you cannot have appliances like Kali Linux and Backtrack Linux. These kind of appliances, this kind of Linux operating system you cannot have on a cloud, because that is directly violating the acceptable use policy of the cloud. So that is what your public cloud is all about. The next is team, we have a community cloud. Now, when I am talking about a community cloud is something which is, we can talk about a shared need. Okay, community cloud means where multiple organizations are in the same line of business, and they have a shared need. Now, one of the live example I can give you, in India, we have a cooperative banks. In India, we have a cooperative banks who are all in the same line of business. So that is a shared need. So community cloud is a perfect example where there are multiple companies who are in the same line of business, and they want to share the resources or share the budget. Now, one of the good example of this I can take, let's say I have three doctors. Okay, I have a doctor 1, I have a doctor 2, and I have a doctor 3. Now there is a requirement that the doctors are planning to purchase an EMR machine. The doctors are planning to purchase an EMR machine. Now the problem is these all doctors are in separate location. So in this case, let's say this doctor is there in the Pune location. This doctor is there in Nagpur location. This doctor is there in Mumbai location. Now the problem is EMR is a very costly machine for for a doctor to purchase. Okay, if all these three doctors, if they want to have a EMR system in their premises, it is going to cost very heavily, and it is going to impact all these three people, because you need to have a good amount of budget if you are planning to have an EMR machine on each of these locations. Okay, so now let's say if in the community cloud, I have one doctor in Pune location, one doctor in Nagpur location, one doctor in Mumbai location, and they want to purchase an EMR. If all these three doctors, they are planning to purchase an EMR specifically in their premises, it's going to cost very heavily, because it's not purchasing an EMR machine is not cheap. It is definitely going to be a costly solution. So now what we can do in this case is these, rather than having an EMR machine hosted on each thing, hosted on Pune, Nagpur and Mumbai, probably what we can have is we can probably host an EMR machine on a public cloud, on a public cloud, which can be accessible to the doctor in Pune location, which can be accessible to the doctor in Nagpur location, and it can be accessible to the doctor in Mumbai location as well. And whatever cost of the public cloud will come, that will be shared by all the three doctors. This is a perfect example of a community cloud, where there is a shared need by all the doctors for the EMR machine. So rather than purchasing an EMR machine and spending a huge amount of capital to install and configure in each location, we are configuring the EMR machine on the public cloud, which will be used by all these three doctors, and the cost of the public cloud will be equally shared by these three. So that is the best example for a community cloud, where there is a shared need by all the three doctors. Finally, the next is we have a hybrid cloud. Finally, the next is we have a high. So now what is the benefit before we go for a hybrid cloud? What is the benefit? One thing is you get a high availability. You get a high availability in the community cloud. So basically you get the resiliency. You get the resiliency. That is one of the primary benefit. Second thing, you get added security. You get added security. And third, you get a reduced cost. You get the reduced cost. What you are spending. Okay, just a minute. Okay, Balaji, resiliency means over here. Okay, when I am talking about high availability and resiliency, now if I am talking about deploying an EMR machine on each of these location, then I need to spend a huge amount of money on, resiliency as well, right? I need, if my system is down, I need to configure a cluster, load balancing, taking a backup, everything, right? But now since I have hosted that in the cloud, I don't have to spend anything on the hardware or software part, right? That is the advantage of going for a resiliency. So one of the advantage of resiliency also is, when we are talking about the resiliency, you're scaling up and scaling down. That is also one form of resiliency only. So depending on the number of users, depending on the load, you can scale up and you can scale down, and you are only paying for what you use. That is the advantage of going for the cloud model. Now the next is finally we have a hybrid cloud. So hybrid cloud, it can be any, it can be, when I am talking about a hybrid cloud, it can be my public, it can be my private, it can be my community. Now, what is the primary benefit of going for a hybrid cloud? The primary benefit of going for, yes, it can be public, private, it can be community. Okay. Now, the primary benefit of going for a public cloud model, the primary benefit of going for a public cloud model is for hardware reuse. We want to reuse the hardware. At the same time, we are also going for a disaster recovery purpose. For disaster recovery purpose, for hardware reuse and all, we are going for the hybrid cloud model. So one of the primary benefit of going for a hybrid cloud is hardware reuse. It can serve for disaster recovery, it can be used for disaster recovery as well, and it can also help me to reduce the cost. It can also help me to reduce the cost. Now, one live example of the community cloud. Okay, one live example of a hybrid cloud I can give you. So let's say one live example of a hybrid cloud I can give you. Let's say in this case, I have in my on-prem Microsoft Exchange server. Okay, I have in my on-prem Microsoft Exchange server. Let's say I am having a Microsoft Exchange server of 2021. Okay, now in this Microsoft Exchange server, I am having around 10,000 mailboxes. I am having around 10,000 mailboxes. But now it is practically becoming impossible for me to manage the size of each and every mailbox, because each and every mailbox, the size is around 10 GB. So now what I want to do, I need to move all these mailboxes. I need to move all these mailboxes to the cloud. Okay. So now let's say in this case, we have a Microsoft Exchange server 2021 where I am having 10,000 mailboxes. Each mailbox size is of 10 GB, which is becoming impossible for my organization to manage. So now what the organization did, the organization purchased the Office 365 solution. The organization purchased an Office 365. Now when we are talking about Office 365, definitely if I am having an on-prem Microsoft Exchange server, then definitely I will be having a Microsoft AD as well, which will be maintained on the on-prem. So what is the first thing? When I decided to go for Office 365, I need to configure an Azure AD on Office 365, and I need to sync my on-prem Active Directory with the Azure Active Directory to move the users from my on-prem to the Azure AD, right team? So anyone in this batch who have worked on the migration of mailboxes, or who have worked on the migration of stuff, they will be able to understand what I'm trying to say. So now if my users are authenticating with the on-prem Active Directory, the first thing is I need to synchronize their on-premises Active Directory user account with the Azure AD. Then I will move my mailboxes of all the employees from my on-prem Microsoft Exchange server to the Office 365. Now in this scenario team, I am maintaining both. I am maintaining my on-prem and I am maintaining my Office 365. This is a perfect example of a hybrid cloud. This is a perfect example of a hybrid cloud. Yes, you are right. Mailbox migration and all. But this is also a good example of a hybrid cloud, right? Because I am having a private and I am having a public cloud. Even though if it is a SaaS solution, but it's a public cloud, right? So it is a perfect example of a hybrid cloud model. But in this case, so let's say, let's take a scenario, even though my hybrid cloud, even though my mailboxes, so let's say earlier I was having my on-prem Exchange server. I was having my on-prem Exchange server, and now I am having Office 365. I am having Office 365. But I want to make sure that any users in Office 365, when they send any email, any employees who send email from Office 365, it should still be redirected from my on-prem mail server only, because in my on-premises I have some anti-spam filters and all. So I have some policies, rules and all configured on my on-prem. So I want all my emails who are whatever emails are being sent from Office 365, rather than directly going to the internet, I want to send it through my on-prem. So this kind of use cases, we normally have it in the hybrid cloud. This kind of use cases, we normally have it in the hybrid cloud. So as the name indicates, the public cloud is available for the general public who want to use computing resources such as software and hardware over the internet. It's a good choice for companies and organizations with low security concerns. There is no need to manage these resources as cloud computing providers configure and manage these services. Generally, public clouds are used for application development and testing. So live example, your taxi website, vehicle e-commerce, hotel booking, like your OYO and all, everything today is based on the public cloud only. Okay, even your Ola and Uber, everything is using the public cloud services only. Okay, not only this, even the hospitals like Cloud9 Hospital, then your Reliance Hospital, everyone as slowly and gradually they have moved to the public cloud services only. Yes, you can say that the web server is on the public cloud and the database is on the private cloud, and there is a proper, web application firewall on the web server RAM, which is protecting my web server and the database against SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and cross-site request forgery. Clear? Yeah, the data they can keep it on the private cloud. That is fine. But whenever the organization is having that kind of a deployment where their web server is in the public and their database is on the private, we need to have a employ the web application firewall and all, so that the, attacks like attacks like your cross-site scripting, cross-site request forgery, SQL injection, input validation attacks cannot happen against the database. So we need to employ the WAF as well, web application firewall. So private cloud, as I mentioned, as the name suggests, the private cloud lets you to use the infrastructure and resources for a single organization. Users and organization do not share resources. Yes, that is the RAM that you are talking about, the top 10 OWASP vulnerabilities. RAM, right? The top 10 OWASP vulnerabilities, which is required on both public and private. So as the name suggests, the private cloud, it lets you to use the infrastructure and resources for a single organization. Users and organization do not share resources with other users. That is why it is called as a internal or corporate model. Private clouds are more costly than public clouds due to their costly and maintenance. So in this case, you can say that there is a vehicle e-commerce website hosted on a private network. Okay, your hotel booking website, your tax website, everything is in the private network only. Just a second. The next is we have a community cloud. The community deployment model is somewhat similar to the private cloud. In the private cloud, only one user or organization owns the cloud server, but in a community cloud, several companies with the same backgrounds, they share the cloud server. If all organizations or companies have the same set of security protocols and performance requirement and goals, this is a multi-tenant architecture can help them to save the cost and boost efficiency. This model can be used in the case of project development, implementation, and maintenance. That is the primary benefit of a community cloud. And finally, we have a hybrid cloud, in which it is a combination of both public and private clouds, where very few companies and organizations can migrate their tech stack to cloud computing rapidly in one go. Hence, cloud vendors came up with a hybrid cloud that offers a smooth transition with public and private cloud facilities. They keep the sensitive data in the private cloud and non-sensitive data in the hybrid cloud. Now, one another example of a public and private cloud I can give you in the hybrid cloud scenario. So let's say if my organization, okay, now one another example I can give you from the public and private cloud in terms of the regulation point of view is, let's say I have a on-prem. Okay, I have a on-prem. So So now when we are talking about from the on-premises point of view, so let's say currently we have a PII data. Okay. Now I have a PII data, like I have a passport number, I have a passport, I have a social security number. Okay. Then in terms of PCI DSS, I have a credit card number. Okay, I have a credit card number. Then according to that, I am also having a PHI regulation. So where I am protecting the PHI, I am maintaining the PHI details as well. So now when we are talking about from the cloud vendor, now when we are talking about from the hybrid point of view, many customers, they don't prefer keeping their sensitive data. Many customers, they don't prefer keeping their sensitive data on the cloud. Many customers, they don't prefer keeping their sensitive data like their PII, PCI DSS, PHI data on the cloud. So that is one of the reason why normally the cloud is stored, used for keeping the non-sensitive data, but always the sensitive data will be maintained in the on-prem. This is also one of the perfect example of a hybrid scenario. This is also one of the perfect example of a hybrid scenario. Okay, now why it is the main reason that customers are not comfortable to keep their PII data. One of the primary reason is the data localization. Okay, because according to all this compliance, according to the GDPR, according to the HIPAA regulation, the data localization is the major concern when we are talking about from the cloud provider point of view, from the customer point of view, because we never know where the data is getting replicated. So if it can be easily, the organization can come under, they can come easily under a breach of GDPR and all. Okay, now one of the another reason why the customers are not comfortable to use the cloud, because in some of the cloud solutions, the vendor always manages the encryption keys. In some of the cloud solutions, the vendor manages the encryption keys, and under any circumstances, no customer will allow the vendor to manage the encryption keys for protecting the confidentiality and integrity of the data. So majority of the customers, even if they are trying to move the data to the cloud, they always prefer to maintain the encryption keys themselves, rather than allowing the cloud vendor to have the encryption keys with them. So this is one of the major reason why the companies, they try to keep their PII data on-prem, their sensitive data on-prem, and other type of data on the cloud. Now to answer your question, Ram, I am using my definitions because it is helpful for people to understand. It's not like I am trying to teach something different other than what is there in the CCSP. Okay. What is there in the CCSP, that only I am teaching. It's just like I am using my own definitions so that it can help people to understand the content in a much more easy way. So now the next is a pre-work. Now, whenever we are going for any kind of cloud vendor, whenever we are going for any kind of cloud vendor, we need to do a pre-work. Now, what do you mean by pre-work? Pre-work means understand the enterprise consuming the CSP services must conduct sufficient due diligence. So you need to clearly understand due to the benefits which is provided by the cloud. So now we have those kind of controls like CASB and all, by which we can still protect the confidentiality and integrity of the data which is hosted on the cloud. Okay, that is the ultimate goal. So like many people in this batch, many people who have come today on this webinar, you must have already finished your CISSP. So CISSP is totally talking about security from an on-prem point of view. CCSP is talking security from a cloud perspective. So how to secure the organization data if they are moving to the cloud. That is what your CCSP is all about. So enterprise consuming the cloud service provider services must conduct sufficient due diligence. They should clearly understand what is the role and responsibility of the cloud service provider versus the enterprise responsibilities, and what is the demarcation between them. They also need to ensure that the CSP IT governance process and procedure align with those of the enterprise operating environment. That the IT governance process of the cloud service provider, it should match with the business requirements of the enterprise. You also need to make sure that the cloud service provider infrastructure is compliant with any legal, regulatory, or industry requirement. So before you onboard a cloud vendor, you need to ask them to share the SOC 1, SOC 2 reports, the CSA star reports, the ISO 27001 reports, and you have to make sure that they are compliant with all the legal, regulatory, and industry requirement. Finally, you need to also ensure that the enterprise has sufficient operational visibility and documentation to meet all audit and security requirements. So these are all the pre-work which you have to do before you onboard a cloud vendor. So now the next is your fundamental cloud computing. So we have a compute services, we have a networking services, and we have a storage services. So now when I am talking about compute services, in compute we have a CPU and ephemeral storage capabilities using a VM. The virtual machine is called as a compute file. It is also called as an image. Auto scaling can be used to automatically change the number of VMs which are deployed. The next is we have a networking services which provides the elastic infrastructure and platform. They rely on the software defined networking. They can be controlled by the customer self-service interface. The customer can design, implement, and configure the virtual circuit firewall and load balancer according to their requirement. So in many organizations, you must have seen that the customer creates their own VPCs, they create their own subnets, internet gateways, everything. So that all comes under the networking services. Finally, we have a storage services where, yes, site to site VPN facilities and all. Then finally, we have a storage service where persistent storage always available after the virtual machine is deprovisioned, and normally backed up mechanical hard drives and SSD. Fault tolerance in storage offering is provided through duplication of data element. So these are some fundamental cloud computing concepts which we have. Finally, this is your cloud service provider data structure. So as you can see, we have a CSP data center, we have a CSP availability zone, and we have a CSP region. So cloud service data center is basically an individual data center that houses the physical computers, storage, data center, networking, and electrical power. We also have a availability zone. So availability zone means they consist of two or more geographical local data centers. So in this case, let's say I am having a data center in Mumbai, so I am having three availability zone 1, 2, and 3. Finally, we have a CSP region which consists of two or more availability zone. So one availability zone is here, one availability zone is in another region, which ensures operational geographic redundancy. Cloud-based solutions should deploy redundant infrastructure in two or more regions with the mutual data backup capability. So here it is showing that where your AWS in India, where your AWS local zones are located. So if we click on get started on the AWS local zones, so these are all the AWS local zones which are available, the ones which are showing in green, the ones which are showing in green. Now, if I click on this is the India location. So these are all the AWS. So we have a local zone in Delhi. We have a local zone in Delhi. We have a local zone in Kolkata. So this is your AWS availability zones.